Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be reading Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds by Philip E. Johnson, Chapter 4, A Real Education in Evolution. A popular teacher encourages young people to rise up for the big issues and think for themselves and gets in trouble for it. A bright young student takes a stand for freedom of thought and runs smack into a wall of official dogma. The authorities use the law to intimidate dissenters and try to discourage citizens from thinking for themselves about the evidence for evolution. Where have we seen all this before? It's a replay of Inherit the Wind, of course, with the characters trading roles. The possibility that Henry Drummond raised in the play has come true. The Darwinists did get a law by saying only Darwinism may be taught in the schools, but they got it from the Supreme Court, not the legislature. In a 1987 decision, the Supreme Court held unconstitutional a Louisiana state law that attempted to require balanced treatment for creation and evolution in the public school classroom. A state may not require, to the majority opinion, that the religious viewpoint that a supernatural being created humankind has be given fair treatment as an alternative to evolution in science classes. In context, that meant the opposite opinion, that humankind was created by a purposeless natural process that cares nothing about us, would be taught as unchallengeable fact. Justice Antonin Scalia argued in dissent that the people of a state, including those who are Christian fundamentalists, are quite entitled, as a secular manner, to have whatever scientific evidence there may be against evolution presented in their schools, just as Mr. Scopes, Bert Cates in the movie, was entitled to present whatever scientific evidence there was for it. The majority emphatically disagrees. Only Darwin may be taught in the schools. The predictable result of this one-sided educational and legal regime is that evolution has become the focus of a culture war instead of a subject that we can discuss constructively in educational institutions or in the political realm of negotiation and compromise. The science educators teach the students that they were created by evolution and that evolution is a purposeless and unsupervised natural process. Of course, those statements go far beyond the scientific evidence and state a religious position. Educators also insist with a straight face that they were not saying anything about the religion of God or God. If they were addressing the subject of religion, they would have not allowed the other side to be argued. Therefore, they must not be addressing it. When students ask intelligent questions like, "Is this stuff really true?" teachers are encouraged or required not to take the question seriously. Instead, they put the students off with public relations jargon about how the scientific enterprise is reliable and self-correcting. In California, for example, the state curriculum guidelines advise teachers not to go into the merits of objections to evolution in class, where other students might be influenced, but to tell objecting students to take such questions up with their parents or minister. When a teacher does try to take the objection seriously, the result is likely to be a lawsuit from the American Civil Liberties Union or the People for the American Way, plus bad publicity in the press. School administrators understandably capitulate and tell teachers and students to stop making trouble. In short, Bert Cates and Henry Drummond have far surpassed their predecessors in using the tools of power to keep dissent from getting out of hand. The situation is obviously unfair to the dissenters, but never mind that for now. I'm more concerned to point out to the scientific community how bad it is for science and for education. Here it is what I want to say to scientists and educators. History has taught us that an established religion tends to fall into bad habits, and the same may be true when a scientific establishment starts to act like a governmental body with an official ideology to uphold. The price of having that kind of position is that you're tempted to protect your power and wealth by defending things you shouldn't be defending, with methods like double talk and intimidating threats of legal action that you shouldn't be using. These become bad habits and they eventually lead you into massive hypocrisy and self-deception. When you preach baloney detecting as an essential tool of science that makes students turn their baloney detectors off when they get to the really important questions of origins, you convict yourself every day of hypocrisy. You also lose the ability to think critically about your own beliefs, and eventually you set yourself up for the kind of embarrassment that destroyed Matthew Harrison Brady. There is only one cure. No matter how badly you want to bury the tough questions, you have to acknowledge that those questions really are too tough to be settled with misleading slogans like evolution is a fact and science and religion are separate realms. You have to admit that people have reasons for objecting to the materialist philosophy you are presenting in the name of science. If you're going to be educators instead of dogmatists, you're going to have to start dealing honestly with those objections. You need to turn your baloney detectors on yourselves. It hurts me a lot at first, but eventually you will learn to enjoy it. Trust me, I've tried it. Critical thinking in evolutionary biology. Can we begin to treat evolution as a subject for education rather than a cultural war? Of course we can. If I were designing a curriculum for high school or college students in evolution, I would build it around the same principles of baloney detecting we considered in the preceding chapter. Here are some of the things I would want students to learn. Number one, learn to distinguish between what scientists assume and what they investigate. Contemporary scientists don't investigate what the Supreme Court called the religious viewpoint that a supernatural being created humankind or anything else. They disregard that possibility because they consider things supernatural to be outside of science. In other words, scientists start by assuming that naturalism is true, and they try to give purely natural explanations for everything, including our existence. Because of that assumption, scientists do not really consider whether evolution, as distinguished from creation, is true or whether evolution might be guided by God. They assume that evolution is the only possibility, that it is unguided, because in their minds, both special creation and guided evolution fall into the territory of religion, not science. They also assume that the natural selection has a great creative power, not because that power can be demonstrated, but because there is no better naturalistic alternative. Students should regard the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, then, as merely the best naturalistic explanation of our existence that science can provide. Whether it is true in another question, we cannot go into that question unless we are allowed to consider the possibility that a creator exists. Understanding the crucial role of philosophy in Darwinism is the key to understanding why the theory is so controversial and why scientists want so badly to dodge the hard questions. Biologists have authority over questions of biology, but they have no authority to impose a philosophy on society. Once the public understands what they are doing, the biologists will lose their power to exclude dissent. That is why it is so important for them to insist that evolution is a fact. Change that to evolution is a philosophy and the game is over. Did creation require a creator? You can assume a negative answer to that question on philosophical grounds, or you can treat it as a question of fact open to scientific investigation, but you can't legitimately do both. I would teach students to try to be distrustful of textbook authors or other authorities who try to have it both ways. Number 2. Learn to use terms precisely and consistently. Evolution is a term of many meanings, and the meanings have a way of changing without notice. Dog breeding and finch beak variations are frequently cited as typical examples of evolution. So is the fact that all different races of humans descend from a single parent, or even that Americans today are larger on average than they were a century ago due to better nutrition. If relatively minor variations like that were all evolution were about, there would be no controversy, and even the strictest biblical fundamentalists would be evolutionists. Of course, evolution is about a lot more than in-species variation. The important issue is whether the dog breeding and finch beak examples fairly illustrate the process that created animals in the first place. Using the single term evolution to cover both the controversial and uncontroversial aspects of evolution is a recipe for misunderstanding. At a minimum, students must learn to distinguish between microevolution, cyclical variation within the type, as in the finch beak example, and macroevolution, the vaguely described process that supposedly creates innovations such as new complex organs or new body parts. Don't be impressed by claims that in a few borderline cases, microevolution may have produced or almost produced new species. The definition of species is flexible and sometimes means no more than isolated breeding group. By such a definition, a fruit fly that breeds in August rather than June may be considered a new species, although it remains a fruit fly. The question is how we get insects and other basic groups in the first place. Darwinists typically, but not always, claim that macroevolution is just microevolution continued over a very long time. The claim is very controversial, and students should learn why. Number 3. Keep your eye on the mechanism of evolution. It's the all-important thing. Some Darwinists distinguish between what they call the fact of evolution and Darwin's particular mechanism. The fact usually just means that the organisms have simply certain similarities, like the DNA genetic code, and are grouped in patterns, mammals, fish, insects, and so on. This pattern of nature is uncontroversial. What's controversial is the cause of the pattern, and particularly whether that cause involves a creator or only a purposeless material mechanism. The problem with separating the fact from the mechanism is that a so-called fact, evolution, doesn't have much scientific content without a testable mechanism for changing one kind of creature into something entirely different, and especially for building the extremely complex organs that all living things possess. Darwin knew this. It's the first major point he makes on the origin of species. The pattern of organisms would provide unsatisfactory evidence for evolution, he argued, until it can be shown how the innumerable species inhabiting this world would have been modified, so as to acquire the perfection of structure which most justly excites our admiration. Darwin's mechanism was natural selection. Today, despite many efforts to find an alternative, there still isn't really a competitor to the two-part Darwinian mechanism of random variation, mutation, and natural selection. Darwinists argue with each other about the relative importance of chance and selection, but some combination of these two elements is just about the only game in town. Remember that the mechanism has to be able to design and build very complex structures like wings and eyes and brains. Remember also that it has to done this reliability again and again. Despite offhand references in the literature to possible alternatives, Darwinian natural selection remains the only serious candidate for a mechanism that might be able to do the job. That, by the way, explains why many Darwinists are reluctant to make a clear distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. They have evidence for a mechanism with minor variations, as illustrated by the finch beak example, but have no distinct mechanism for the really creative kind of evolution, the kind that builds new body plans and new complex organs. Either the macroevolution is just microevolution continued over longer time, or it's a mysterious process with no known mechanism. A process like that isn't all different from a miraculous or God-guided process, and it certainly wouldn't support these expansive philosophical statements about evolution being purposeless and undirected. In my experience, the distinction between the fact of evolution and the neo-Darwinian theory always turns out to be just a debating gimmick to hide the problem with the mechanism from scrutiny. Once the fact is established, it turns out to include the necessary mechanism, which is mutation and selection. Don't let anybody tell you that the mechanism is a mere detail. It's what the controversy is mainly about. When critics subject the mechanism to detailed criticism, Darwinists very quickly run out of evidence. That's when they want to substitute a vague fact, which will later be inflated to include the whole theory. It's another example of bait and switch. Number 4. Learn the differences between testing a theory against evidence and using selected bits of evidence to support the theory. I've long been fascinated by the conflicting messages Darwinists provide concerning the fossil evidence. On one hand, they proudly point to a small number of fossils that supposedly confirm the theory. These include the vulnerable bird reptile Archaeopteryx, the whale with feet called Ambulocetus, and the therapsid that supposedly link reptiles to mammals, especially the hominids or ape men, like the famous Lucy. These examples, all from vertebrate animals, are pressed very insistently on me in debates as proof of the fact of evolution, even of the Darwinian mechanism. I'm not as impressed by such examples as Darwinists think I should be, because I know that the fossil record overall is extremely disappointing to Darwinian expectations. One prime example is the Cambrian explosion, where the basic animal groups all appear suddenly without evidence of evolutionary ancestors. What is even more interesting is that the evidence for Darwinian macroevolutionary transformation is the most conspicuously absent just where the fossil evidence is most plentiful, among marine invertebrates. These animals are plentiful in fossils because they are so frequently covered in sediment upon death, whereas land animals are exposed as scavengers into the elements. If the theory were true and the correct explanation for the difficulty in finding ancestors were the incompleteness of the fossil record, the evidence for macroevolutionary transitions would be the most plentiful where the record is the most complete. Here's how Niles Eldredge, one of the world's leading experts on invertebrate fossils, describes the actual situation. No wonder paleontologists shied away from evolution for so long. It never seems to happen. Acidus collecting of the cliff face yields zigzags, minor oscillations, and the very occasional slight accumulation of change over millions of years, at a rate too slow to account for all the prodigious change that has occurred in evolutionary history. When we do see the introduction of evolutionary novelty, it usually shows up with a bang, and often with no firm evidence that the fossils did not evolve elsewhere. Evolution cannot forever be going on somewhere else. Yet that's how the fossil record has struck many a forlorn paleontologist looking to learn something about evolution. Eldredge also explains the pressures that could easily lead a forlorn paleontologist to constitute a doubtful fossil as an ancestor or an evolutionary transitional. Science takes for granted that the ancestors existed and the transitions occurred, so scientists ought to be finding positive evidence that they expect to have successful careers. According to Eldredge, the pressure for positive results, is enormous. This pressure is particularly great in the area of human evolution, where success in establishing a fossil to human ancestor can turn to an obscure paleontologist into a celebrity. Human evolution is also an area where the evidence is most subject to subjective interpretation, because ape and human bones are relatively similar. If you find an ape or human bone that's a bit unusual, can you construct it as a piece of a pre-human ancestor? If you can, and the other experts will support you, your future may be a glorious one. In light of those pressures and temptations, how confident should we be that the fossils of human ancestors are really thought they purport to be? Could the wish be followed to the thought, as it so often is? To forestall outraged protests, I should emphasize that there is nothing cynical about asking these questions, nor do they imply anything that anybody is committing a deliberate fraud. Remember that the wise words of Richard Feynman. The first principle, you must not fool yourself, for you are the easiest person to fool. Think how easy it would be if for ambitious fossil hunters to fool themselves, while the reward for doing so may be a cover story in National Geographic and a lifetime of research funding. Think how much pressure the other physical anthropologists are under to develop standards that will allow some fossils to be authenticated as human ancestors. A fossil field without fossils is a candidate for extinction. Keeping all that in mind, why do you think such a high proportion of the fossils used to prove evolution come from this one specialty? Why do you think Niles Eldridge, a specialist in marine invertebrates, used hominid examples rather than the vast record of fossil invertebrates to argue the case for evolution? If anybody tries to tell you that questions like these are improper, as they probably will, your baloney detector should blow a fuse. A scientist who objects to scientific testing is like a banker who doesn't want the books to be audited by independent accountants. View such people with suspicion. Number 5. Learn the difference between intelligent and unintelligent causes. This is a distinction that many otherwise capable scientists do not understand because their materialist philosophy teaches them to disregard it. I'll illustrate the point with a couple of examples. Tim Barrow is a professor of zoology at Ohio State University. He wrote a book that was published by the Stanford University Press with the title Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, a basic guide to the facts and evolution debate. Barrow's book has much the same purpose as this book. It aims to explain, for non-scientists, how good thinkers should view the conflict between evolution and creation. Here is Barrow's explanation of evolution, which comes illustrated with photographs of automobiles in the middle of the book. Everything evolves in the sense of descent with modification, whether it be government policy, religion, sports cars, or organisms. A revolutionary fiberglass Corvette evolved from more mundane automotive ancestors in 1953. Other high points in the Corvette's evolutionary refinement included the 1962 model, in which the original 102-inch was shortened to 98 inches and the new closed coupe Stingray model was introduced. The 1968 model, the forerunner of today's Corvette morphology, which emerged with the removable roof panels, in the 1978 Silver Anniversary model with fastback styling. Today's version continues the stepwise refinements that have been accumulating since 1953. The point is that the Corvette evolved through a selection process acting on variations that resulted in a series of transitional forms and an endpoint rather distinct from the starting point. A similar process shapes the evolution of organisms. Of course, every one of those Corvettes was designed by engineers. The Corvette sequence, like the sequence of Beethoven's symphonies or the options of United States Supreme Court, does not illustrate naturalistic evolution at all. It illustrates how intelligent designers would typically achieve their purposes by adding variations to a basic plan. Above all, such sequences have no tendency whatever to support the claim that there is no need for a creator, since blind natural forces can do the creating. On the contrary, they show what biologists present as proof of the evolution or common ancestry is just as likely to be evidence of common design. I described the credentials of Professor Barrow and named the publisher so nobody could accuse me of attacking a straw man. A distinguished university press would not publish such a book without obtaining professional reviews certifying that its scientific explanations were reliable. Evidently, the reviewers saw nothing wrong with equating automotive engineering and biological evolution. I'm not surprised, because evolutionary biologists typically do not understand that sequences resulting from variations on common design principles, as in the Corvette series, point to the existence of a common design, not its absence. I've encountered this mistake so often in public debates that I've given it a nickname, Barrow's blunder. And a somewhat more sophisticated version of Barrow's blunder is to confuse artificial, that is intelligent, selection with natural selection. Francis Crick, who's a celebrated molecular biologist and a fervent scientific materialist, argues the case for Darwinism in these words. If you doubt the power of natural selection, I urge you, to save your soul, to read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. I think you will find it a revelation. Dawkins gives a nice argument to show how far the process of evolution can go in the time available to it. He points out that man, by section, has produced an enormous variety of types of dogs, such as Pekingese, bulldogs, and so on, in the space of only a few thousand years. Here, man is the important factor in the environment, and it is his particular tastes that have produced, by selective breeding, not by design, the freaks of nature we see preserved all around us as domestic dogs. Yet the time required to do this on an evolutionary scale of hundreds of millions of years is extraordinarily short. So we should not be surprised at the greater variety of creatures that natural selection has produced on a much larger time scale. Was Crick aware that the domestic animal breeding requires pre-existing purposeful intelligence? He seems to have sensed it on one level and then wished the ugly fact away by an verbal antithesis, selective breeding, not design. Once again, we see the truths of Feynman's writing. The easiest person to fool is yourself. Only a powerful unconscious need to overlook the truth could have allowed Crick to conceal from himself that animal breeders are intelligent agents, not blind natural forces. Breeders use expert skills to select the variants they want, and they carefully protect their own over-specialized breeds from the natural selection that would otherwise prevent such freaks from surviving to reproduce their own kind. Selective breeding is not the same as natural selection or even analogous to it. It is intelligent design. Critical thinking is good for religion too. Every scientific materialist who reads this will understandably want to ask, are you willing to apply baloney detecting to religion as well as science? The answer is emphatically yes. I can't think of a better way to introduce students to Christianity than to invite them to read the Gospels with care, to ask all the tough questions. I'm also not particularly worried about how they answer those questions the first time, though. Dealing with the tough questions is a lifelong business, and the most important educational point is not to try to spoon feed students with oversimplified answers that won't stand the test of time and experience. Here are two examples of the kinds of issues I'd like young people to begin to think about. Number 6, the problem of suffering. One of the seeming advantages of Darwinism is that it makes it unnecessary to ask why God permits the innocent to suffer and sometimes the wicked to prosper. In a materialistic universe, moral arbitrariness is only to be expected. As Richard Dawkins puts it, nature is not interested one way or the other in suffering, unless it affects the survival of DNA. Some religious people actually like Darwinism because they think it gets God off the hook. If, for some reason, the divine plan involved creating by means of scientific laws, then God couldn't intervene to prevent suffering without spoiling his own grand scheme. I don't find that convincing, but it's clear that some Darwinists believe in their theory less because of the scientific evidence than because they have theological or philosophical objections to supernatural creation. Of all the errors of scientific materialism, the silliest is that resolution of the National Academy of Sciences that religion and science are separate realms that should never be considered the same context. On the contrary, evolutionary scientists are obsessed with the God question, and the problem of suffering is one important aspect of that question. I will tell students that none of the usual answers to the problem of suffering is entirely satisfactory. I'd want my students to have some familiarity with the classic treatments of the problem, especially the Book of Job and the Grand Inquisitor section of Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, as well as a good Christian like C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain. I want to read them to read the Psalms and the Gospels with the problem fully in mind, and to think about whether and how the suffering and resurrection of Jesus helps with it. I want them to understand that the sum of the appeal of Darwinism stems from the classic philosophical objections to the doctrine that the world is governed by a creator who loves us and cares about what we do. Above all, I'd want them to face the fact that if science has an unsolved problem, so does religion. We all see through a glass darkly, but what glass should we try to see through? 7. The problem of faith. One of the illustrations of scientific materialism is its instances that materialists don't have faith commitments. Faith is not something that some people have and others don't. Faith also isn't something opposed to reason. Faith is something that everybody needs to get started in any direction and to keep going in the face of discouragement. Reason builds on a foundation of faith. For example, scientific materialists have faith that they will eventually find a materialistic theory to explain the origin of life, even though the experimental evidence may be pretty discouraging for now. Because they have faith in their theory, Darwinists believe that the common ancestors for the animal phyla once lived on the earth, even though those ancestors can't be found. Niles Eldredge calls himself a knee-jerk neo-Darwinist, in spite of the invertebrate fossil record, because he is convinced on philosophical grounds that the theory must be true. That's every bit as much as a faith commitment as the belief of a young Earth creationist that all the radiometric dating must be wrong because it contradicts the literal words of Genesis. Because it is a lot easier to deal with the problem of suffering if pain and death first entered the world after human beings have sinned. Given that every position has its difficulties, where should we put our faith? To use the words that Jesus taught us, what is the foundation of solid rock, and what is the foundation of sand? The Christians say that the rock is God, and we should trust in the goodness of God all the more when the presence of evil and suffering inclines us to doubt. The materialists say that the rock is matter, and we should never move from an unshakable faith in science and materialism, even when we begin to be discouraged by difficulties of explaining all the things that do exist without allowing a role to the Creator, beginning a new century and a new millennium. Whatever their faith commitments, good thinkers ought to be dissatisfied with the way things stand at the present time. The evidence that can survive baloney detecting isn't likely to satisfy either materialists or creationists. It seems for now as if new forms appeared mysteriously or by known mechanism at various widely spread times in Earth's history. Maybe we'll be stuck with a mystery like that indefinitely, but I think it's more likely the 21st century will see a scientific revolution that will completely change our understanding of the history of life. If I'm right about that, the chance to participate in discovering that new understanding should be a thrilling prospect for young people looking forward to a career in science. What makes science sound boring is the impression that books give. The important things have already been discovered, and all there is left to do is fill in the details. Showing young people that there is a lot we don't know, and that we may even be dead wrong about some of the things that we do know, is the way to fire their imaginations. I don't know what the new theories the future may bring, but I think I know where the revolution may start. It may start with the realization that life is not the product of mindless natural forces. Life was designed.